Welcome back to Milkshakes, Markets, and Madness. It's July 4th weekend. I hope you're all out having a fantastic time. I hope you're all being careful, and I hope you all return with all your fingers on Monday morning. And I hope you are all enjoying the fruits of the American experiment. And the reason it's called the American experiment is because it's the first time in history, at least at scale, where a government was set up by the people and the powers were bestowed from the people to the government or to the folks running the place, rather than the people from the top making the rules and telling the citizens what they could do. And it has been 250 years of success. Now, it hasn't always been successful, and it hasn't meant that there hasn't been extreme problems along the way. And it doesn't mean that we don't have extraordinary challenges ahead of us. But so far, it has produced some pretty good results. And I hope that everybody is out enjoying the fruits of those labors today. Now, this is going to be a fairly short episode because I'm going out of town shortly. And I'm not sure we're going to have an episode next week. So I apologize for everybody who looks forward to this every weekend. But what I thought we would do today is I'm just going to tell you guys a story. And I'm going to tell you a story because this came up on a podcast I was doing earlier this week. And I actually think it's a pretty good story. And perhaps there's some lessons in here. And that is, I think many of you know that several years ago, I set up a small gold fund. I set it up in 2012. And the idea was that I wanted to do it a little different than everybody else. I wanted to have physical gold. I wanted to have it outside the banking system, wanted to have it outside the United States, wanted to be able to hedge it, wanted to be able to buy some mining shares as well. And I wanted to be able to do it in one place rather than in all these separately managed accounts. So we did that. And, in 2012, it went pretty well. But in the process of setting up the fund, I was like, listen, I'm kind of a nobody. I need some help with this. And so I reached out to some people who were not just smarter than me, but were kind of legends. And one of them was Rick Rule, and he agreed to be on my advisory board. One of them was a guy named Don Kagan, and he agreed to be on my advisory board. And Don Kagan is one of the foremost numismatic experts in the country, and often gets called in when they find treasure, buried in the Sierras or on a treasure ship sunk off the coast of Florida. And the other person that I called up and said, hey, I need you to be on my advisory board was this fairly well-known guy named Jim Rogers. And Jim Rogers, I'm being facetious because Jim Rogers is obviously a legend. And I didn't just call him up because I certainly didn't have his phone number. But what I did have, and I'm not sure how I had it, but I had his email. And so I sent him an email saying, hey, I'm going to be in Singapore. He was living in Singapore. I'm going to be in Singapore. By the way, I was not going to be in Singapore, but I just said, I'm going to be in Singapore. Could I come see you? I need help with something. And to my surprise, he actually responded. And he said, I'm not going to be in Singapore. I'm actually going to be in New York. And I said, well, that's funny because my flight to Singapore actually takes me through New York. And I said, I'll see you in New York. And he came again. For some reason, he kept responding. He's like, well, I'm very busy. And who are you again? And I said, listen, I'm nobody, but I'm doing this and I'm working on this gold project and I just need a little bit of your time. And he said, well, listen, I'm super busy, but if you want to meet me outside the gym at the Hilton Hotel on Avenue of the Americas at, 8 a.m. on Wednesday, I'll give you a few minutes. Now, mind you, I thought we were going to meet outside the gym. So, but long story short, I said, okay, I'll do it. So, of course, I was not planning to be in New York, but I booked a ticket to New York. And I show up wearing a three-piece suit and a tie. And I thought I was going to get him just outside before he went into the gym at 8 a.m. So I show up at like 7:30 because I don't want to be late. And I'm sitting there waiting for like 30 minutes and he's not there. Finally, I kind of walk into the gym and I see him over on the other side of the room on a stationary bike, pedaling away, sweating like profusely. And so I said to the person, manning the gate, so to speak, the receptionist, I said, I'm supposed to, meet with the Jim at 8 o'clock. I guess he's already here. And I said, can I just walk over and talk to him? And they're like, yeah. So I walked over there. I'd never met the guy before. He's like pedaling away. It's pretty funny. I'm sitting on this stationary bike next to him in a three-piece suit and he's pedaling away. And he's like, what do you want? And I said, well, I'm Brent Johnson and This is what I'm doing. And, I need your help. And he said, what do you mean you need my help? I said, well, I'm nobody important. I just have this idea. I think it's important that my clients own gold. I think, you're a big advocate for gold. And I think you could help me with that. And he's like, well, this is very unusual. I've never done anything like this before. And he said something like, but I appreciate the effort you put in to get here. And so he said, I'm not saying yes, but I'm not saying no. Send me whatever information you have, and I'll talk to you in a few weeks when I'm back home. So that was it. It was about 5 minutes long. And the funny thing was, when I was leaving the gym, there was some other young guy standing at the reception counter, and I could hear him talking to the receptionist saying, hey, I'm supposed to be meeting Jim Rogers here. So anyway, I guess I'm not the only one who tried. But long story short, a few weeks later, I sent him another email. I said, hey, I sent you this info. And he, again, shockingly, he responded and he said, okay, call me at this time. So I called him and told him what I was doing. He said, I've never done anything like this before, but okay, I'll do it. He said, but how much are you going to pay me? And I said, well, I don't know. I'll give you this percent. Right. And I said, what do you want? And he said, how about you give me this percent? And I said, well, about half of that sounds a lot better to me. And he kind of laughed and he said, okay, we'll do that. So we hung up. And then about 10 minutes later, I got to thinking, I was like, well, it doesn't help if I just tell people he's an advisor. I have to so I called him back and I said, hey, Jim, here's the problem. I said, when people ask me who's on my advisory board and I tell them you, they're all going to be really excited. And the next question they're going to ask me is he invested in the fund? So I said, I have to be able to tell them yes. So he's like, are you asking me for money? I said, yeah, I'm asking you for money. He's like, how much do I have to invest? I said, I don't care. You can just send me whatever you want to send me. You're in. And so he actually sent me a check. And I'm not going to tell you how much it was, but it was enough that I appreciated it. And anyway, we went on from there. And so, okay, so that was 2012. And so 2012 was okay in the precious metals market. And then we get into 2013. Now, remember, one of the reasons I set up the fund myself was because I wanted to do things a little differently than just allocating to a fund. And one of the things I wanted to have the ability to do was to hedge our exposure if I thought it was needed. So if you guys remember 2013, so in 2012, gold kind of went sideways, but in 2013, it had a very big drawdown. I'm actually going to pull the chart of gold up here. So this is about where we started, right in, where is this at? You guys see that? I think we started right around here. And so gold was it went up and down, but it kind of finished up a little bit for the year on 2012. So 2012 was. And then if you remember in January, I was actually on a trip into New York in early January, and gold had a big sell-off. And I remember thinking, well, it hasn't really pulled back that much, but it's probably not a horrible idea to have some hedges. So we hedged the portfolio. Now, we didn't hedge at all, and I certainly didn't think those hedges were going to pay off. But then this came, the huge drawdown in April. And basically, it kept falling all the way to the end of June. Now, don't get me wrong, we hedged it, and so that helped, but it was still very painful. And during this time period where it was just going down like this, I was not feeling too good. But here's the other thing. But by the way, here's what silver did during that time period. So let's just see. Where's silver? Silver was kind of up it was kind of up slightly for 2012, but then it had this big sell-off as well. So if you look, this date right here was actually June 28th, or it was, I specifically remember it was the last week of June, and I'll tell you why. And then this right here was the last week of June. And so even though we had our hedges, it was very painful. And I will tell you, behind the scenes, people who, when you go to a conference, they're all up on stage and they're all sounding very smart. And they all say, you have to be a contrarian and you have to buy when there's blood in the streets and don't worry about I just happen to know a lot of these people and I happen to speak to a lot of people. And everybody was freaking out. The people that you would look at up on stage, they were freaking out, worried they were going to lose their business. And because we had our hedges, we were actually down, but not down as much as everybody else. And by the way, the mining stocks had gotten really crushed. And so I said to myself, holy cow. I said, this is it. This is literally the blood in the streets moment. Everybody else is freaking out. We had hedges on a relative basis. We're in better shape than everybody else. And I thought that was it. I said, so we pulled our hedges. I don't remember the exact date. I don't remember if it was June 27th, June 28th, June 29th, but we timed it perfectly. We pulled all our hedges. We put the money that we had made on the hedges back into gold, and we bought calls on silver. And I specifically remember the time period because then it was July 3rd, 2nd or 3rd, and I was riding in the car with my friend up to Lake Tahoe because we had rented a house in Tahoe for the weekend. And our wives and kids were already up there, and he and I were driving up from San Francisco to Lake Tahoe. And he was asking me how work was going, and I said, "Well, it was a pretty brutal second quarter, but I think that was it. And we just went long, and we think this is going to work out." And this is what happened over the next 3 weeks. Actually, so that goes into the end of August. So from the end of June to the end of August, so about a 2-month period, silver and gold and the mining shares rocketed higher. So gold went from 1220 to almost 1400. Silver went from 20, or hold on, let me find out. Went from 27 to 34, 35. And we had bought a bunch of calls. And man, did I feel smart. I felt so smart. And I was like, literally, that's it. You just buy when there's blood in the streets. It's all easy. And so the funny part about it's not funny when you lose. First of all, it's never funny when you lose money. But when you look back now and the lessons you've learned, time does allow you to laugh at some big mistakes. But the reason I'm telling this story is because right here in the middle of August or early September, I think it was the middle of August. Yeah, because silver had gone up a lot. It was kind of the end of August. And I saw, and listen, over this time, I would get to talk to Jim and Rick and these guys, maybe, for an hour every quarter or something. And so I saw that Jim was actually going to be at a conference in San Francisco in August. And so I sent him an email and said, hey, since you're going to be here, why don't you let me come over? Let me tell you what's going on with the fund and we can catch up or something like that. And he said, I'm very busy, but I have the afternoon free on whatever Thursday, come over at 2:00. So I go over to his hotel room at 2:00 on Thursday or whatever day it is. And he asked me how it's going. I said, well, Q2, I said, you see the statements. The Q2 was rough, but our hedges helped us. I said, I told him that we had pulled the hedges at the end of June. And I said, we had bought call options on silver and, those had obviously done very well. And we had made up all the losses. And he said to me, well, that was a pretty good move. And I said, well, I was feeling pretty good about myself. I said, of course. I said, well, thank you. Yeah, it was good. He says, well, what are you going to do now? I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, what are you going to do now? You think you made this great move? And he says, it sounds like a great trade. He said, are you going to cash it in or are you going to let it ride? And I went through this big explanation. So the thing you have to remember here is they were doing QE at this time. And the big debate in August and September going into that Fed meeting was whether they were going to taper QE or not. And on all the financial magazines and all the financial news, that was the big thing. Are they going to taper or are they not? Are they going to taper or not? And they threatened to taper, and some people believed in something. So I kind of had gone through this whole analysis, and I had come to the conclusion they were not going to taper. And so I went through and explained to him my whole rationale, and I thought that they weren't going to taper, and I thought that would mean that they were going to continue to print money, and as a result, the dollar would lose value, and gold and silver would go higher. And he said, that's very interesting. And I thought I'm pouring my heart out to this guy thinking, I've kind of figured everything out. And he says to me, that's very interesting. But I could tell he's very skeptical. I said, well, you don't sound like I'm right. I said, what do you think? He said, well, I'm not going to tell you what I think. I'll never forget this. He said, because if I'm right, you'll take all the credit. And if I'm wrong, you will blame me. So he said, I'm going to let you figure it out for yourself. He says, I know what I would do, but I'm going to let you figure it out for yourself. And I said, okay. So this is the part of the story where the lesson comes in. Because did I listen to Jim Rogers? And I knew that he was very skeptical. But did I listen to Jim Rogers? Did I listen to the legend that I had basically begged to be my advisor for this very moment? Or did pride get the best of me? Now, you kind of already know the end of this story, don't you? So, long story short, pride got the best of me. I did not listen to Jim Rogers. I thought he was wrong. I thought I was right. Oh, I forgot one part of this. He said, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I can tell you this, and I will never forget this line for as long as I live. He said, I'm not going to tell you what I would do because, again, if I'm right, you'll take the credit, and if I'm wrong, you're going to blame me. He said, but I will tell you this. He said, gold and silver will not bottom until Americans can find India on a map. I thought that was a pretty good line, but I was like, well, I know where India is. And he obviously wasn't talking about me. He's talking about the country as a whole. But so long story short, I knew that he thought I should take the profit. But he wasn't going to tell me what to do. And I didn't listen to him. And so then we get into right here. So silver went from, by the way, I had those numbers wrong. I was looking at 2012 here. Here is silver. It was 18 and it went to like 25. So that was that big run up in 2013. And so here, then it starts. So I must have been talking to him right around the top because it was mid to late August. And then we kind of get into this right here is the Fed meeting. And you know what? I was right. They didn't taper. For all the reasons I said they wouldn't taper, they didn't taper. But instead of pushing people back into gold and silver because the dollar was going to lose value, what everybody did was plow back into equities. And silver went all the way back down to the lows. And it took another 10 years from 2013 all the way to 2023, or I guess 9 years. Or actually, you could call it 7 years. But here it was around $20 when I was having this conversation with him in 2013. And 20 years or 10 years later, it was still around $20. Now, it's obviously had a huge run since then, we all know. The reason I bring this up now is because right here in January, when silver was at $110, actually, I was at a conference in Vancouver. And I bumped into Rick Rule the night of, and I said, crazy world in silver, huh? And he said, yeah, I sold all my silver. And I said, I sold some too, and I'm going to sell some tomorrow. And he said, I learned a little bit over that time period. He said, this is crazy. He said, you know, every time a chart goes like that, it will look like that on the other side as well. And then the next day, both he and Ross Beatty were at the conference, and they were on stage saying, hey guys, we're in a bubble. This is not going to last. You got to take some profits. The right side of the chart's going to look like the left side of the chart. And on Twitter and at the conference, there were people, young guys like I was at the time 10 years ago, or back in 2013, talking to Jim Rogers saying, the legends have lost their touch. They no longer have the edge. They no longer understand the market. But let me tell you, the legends are legends for a reason, and they're not stupid people. And so when the legends tell you to think twice about something, or when the legends tell you not to be so sure, and when the legends tell you that there's more to this game than you initially think there is, listen to them. This was a very expensive lesson for me to learn, but I did learn it, right? Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to get everything right going forward. It doesn't mean that I won't make mistakes again. But my point is that just when you think you have everything figured out, just when your thesis is playing out perfectly, is the very moment when you need to question everything you think you know. And that's it for today's lesson. I will leave it at that. That's 20 minutes. I thought I was going to tell this story in 5 minutes, and it took me 20 minutes. But anyway, that was the lesson that I had to learn. I hope none of you have to learn a lesson as painful as I do. You know, another great line that Rick Rule says is he says, use my scar tissue to protect your portfolio. The reason he says that, not because he never had pain, it's because he experienced so much pain along the way. He has scar tissue, but he learned that's how you learn. So I hope many, and first of all, I know most of you will not learn this lesson on your own from listening to people like me or the others. You kind of have to go through it yourself. Nobody ever really learns by reading a book, or else mistakes would never be made. But the point is for the few of you out there who can keep an open mind and question your certainty and question your philosophy while also keeping your long-term conviction, I think it's going to pay a dividends for you. In any case, again, happy 4th. I hope you guys all have a great weekend. Not sure I'll be back again next week, but if not, I'll see you in 2 weeks, and peace. Happy July 4th.